We did not ask the world to mourn our soldiers. We asked it to notice what still stands after the smoke cleared our will to be free.
President Ibrahim Traoré. On a quiet July night in the heart of Burkina Faso, 50 soldiers held their ground. By morning, their base had been reduced to rubble. But what they left behind was not defeat. It was a question. Why did this happen, and why now? To most of the world, it was another headline from Africa. But to those paying attention, it was something far deeper. A message delivered not through words, but through fire. This wasn't just a military tragedy. It was a moment that shook a nation striving to chart its own course. In Dargo, a fortress fell, but a story rose. Who stands to gain when a young country decides to govern its own resources? And why do those who choose sovereignty so often find themselves under fire? This is more than breaking news. It is a moral crossroads. If you've ever believed that liberty should not come at the cost of punishment, stay with us. Because this story isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about what happens when a nation stops asking permission and starts walking forward. In the northern province of Bam, not far from the village farms and winding roads of Burkina Faso, lies the small town of Dargo. For most of its history, Dargo was like many towns across West Africa, quiet, resilient, often overlooked. But in the struggle for a new kind of independence, Dargo became something else, a front line. On July 29, 2025, a military outpost stationed in the Dargo district came under coordinated attack. According to witnesses and local reports, nearly 100 armed militants stormed the base in the early hours of the morning. The assault lasted hours. When it ended, 50 soldiers were gone. This wasn't the first time Burkina Faso faced such violence. The country, like much of the Sahel region, has battled waves of insurgency for over a decade. Armed groups, many with shifting allegiances and unclear sponsors, have taken root in remote zones. In some areas, they've become shadow authorities. But what made Dargo different was timing. Just months before President Ibrahim Traoré's administration had launched a bold series of reforms, from nationalizing gold resources to limiting foreign military presence. The Dargo base was one of many outposts securing these new initiatives. Its soldiers weren't just defending territory, they were guarding a vision. And that's why the attack hurt so deeply. Burkina Faso had become a symbol across Africa, not because it was perfect, but because it was trying to rely less on aid and more on itself, trying to build schools, train volunteers, refine its own gold, trying to ask questions that hadn't been asked in decades. What does African sovereignty look like, not on paper, but on the ground? To many outside observers, Dargo was a tactical setback. But inside Burkina Faso, it felt personal. The base stood for protection. Its fall was a wound, not just to a nation's defense, but to its morale. And so Dargo matters, not because of the town's size or its strategic value, but because of what it represents in the story of a country pushing against the tide. Burkina Faso didn't just lose a base that day. It gained clarity about the cost of walking alone. At first glance, what happened in Dargo could be seen as a brutal ambush, another devastating chapter in Burkina Faso's battle against insurgents. But the details, the timing, and the precision raise deeper questions. Was this simply an attack, or was it a signal survivors recall that it began just before dawn? A sudden barrage of gunfire lit up the night, followed by the sharp rhythm of advancing feet. The attackers moved with discipline. They disabled vehicles, cut communications, then stormed the barracks. By the time reinforcements arrived from nearby towns like Kaya and Kungusi, the base was already engulfed in flames. It was not chaos, it was choreography. And that is what unsettled so many in the days that followed. In previous attacks, militants often struck and retreated quickly. But in Dargo, they looted, destroyed, and sent a message. Why that base? Why that week? And why so soon after Burkina Faso launched its first national gold refinery, a facility meant to keep wealth from leaving the country. President Ibrahim Traoré had only months earlier declared that Burkina Faso would chart its own path. His administration had ended military partnerships with foreign powers, focusing instead on homegrown defense units and community-based intelligence. Some in the international press warned that such moves were reckless. Others claimed it was a mistake to send foreign troops home. Then Dargo happened. Editorials in Washington, Paris, and London were swift. They suggested the attack proved Burkina Faso's leadership was unprepared, even irresponsible. But on the ground, a different feeling took hold. This was no accident, people said. This was retaliation not from the insurgents alone, but perhaps from interests that had something to lose. It's a theory not without merit. Similar patterns have been seen in history. In places where governments try to reclaim control over natural resources or reject foreign influence, sudden violence often follows. The Congo, Libya, Guinea, even Haiti in its early independence. Some Burkinabe citizens began to ask a difficult question. Is this what happens when a small nation says no? What complicates the picture even more is the silence. For nearly 48 hours after the assault, there was no official word from the government, no press conference, no army statement, just rumors and grief. And yet, from within that silence, emerged stories of resilience. A young lieutenant, injured and breathless, told state radio, "We held the line until we had nothing left." His voice, carried through social media, became a rallying cry. In marketplaces, people donated food to local defense units. In villages, candlelight vigils honored the fallen. And instead of fleeing, as many had in past attacks, rural families pledged to stay. That shift in reaction speaks volumes. For years, violence in Burkina Faso had driven fear, doubt, and even migration. But this time was different. The people did not see Dargo as proof that their government was failing. They saw it as proof that someone wanted them to stop trying. And they refused. Within military circles, there was no talk of retreat. Instead, there were vows to return. A senior officer said, "Our brothers died standing. We will honor them by doing the same." In a solemn memorial in Ouagadougou, soldiers saluted photographs of the fallen. Parents wept. Children placed flowers. But the atmosphere was not defeatist. It was determined. The idea that Dargo was more than a military strike began to spread not just in Burkina Faso, but across West Africa. Leaders in neighboring countries, particularly those aligned with Traoré's push for sovereignty, issued public statements of support. Youth movements posted images of Dargo alongside slogans like, "We stand with Burkina," and "Africa will decide." What outsiders may call instability, many Africans now view as a test of will. So was Dargo a betrayal or a battle? Maybe it was both. A betrayal if forces beyond Burkina Faso, threatened by its independence, allowed or enabled the strike. A battle because what took place wasn't just about soldiers. It was about an idea. The idea that a nation, even a small one, has the right to say, "We will build our future, not lease it." And that is what remains long after the flames are gone. Dargo was not the end of a story. It was a new beginning. In the hours after the attack on the Dargo base, smoke still lingered, but something else hung heavier in the air: suspicion. Burkina Faso's military command moved quickly. Patrols were sent into the nearby forests. Surveillance drones took to the skies. Reports surfaced that more than 30 of the attackers had been killed during their retreat. Several vehicles loaded with stolen supplies were found abandoned. Some destroyed, others left in haste. But it wasn't just what the insurgents left behind that drew attention. It was what they carried and what it revealed. Among the debris, security teams recovered encrypted satellite phones, unfamiliar ammunition packaging, and handwritten maps marked with locations that weren't public knowledge. More tellingly, several attackers had documents bearing symbols not commonly associated with any domestic faction. These weren't local bandits. The findings hinted at something more structured and more connected. According to leaked preliminary analysis from intelligence officers, the operation had characteristics resembling externally supported militancy, not just in firepower, but in strategy. The kind of coordination rarely seen without deep pockets, prior training, and detailed intelligence. Analysts who have studied similar attacks in Mali and Niger pointed out overlapping patterns: hit critical infrastructure, exploit timing, avoid maximum confrontation, and disappear into sympathetic terrain. So the question became louder. Who helped them? President Traoré's administration had in recent months made moves that unsettled powerful interests. Gold concessions were reclaimed from multinational corporations. Foreign military agreements were canceled. A large-scale gold refinery, the first in Burkina Faso, had just opened its doors. For the first time in decades, the country wasn't shipping raw gold overseas. It was refining it at home. This shifted more than just profits. It shifted influence. Minerals, especially gold, have long played a silent but central role in Africa's geopolitics, and those who control the flow from extraction to export often operate far from the spotlight. When a state begins to nationalize what was once privatized or bring transparency to what was once shadowed, it doesn't just change policy. It threatens established networks. That's why some in Burkina Faso, from farmers to former officials, began to ask if the Dargo attack wasn't just insurgency, but economic warning. A message not from distant militants, but from those losing access to what they once claimed as theirs. This isn't without precedent. In the 1950s, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo faced similar pressures after attempting to reclaim control over the nation's mineral wealth. Decades later, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso himself was met with resistance for promoting self-reliance and rejecting foreign interference. Both men were celebrated for their vision and silenced before their work was complete. The worry now is whether history is rhyming once again. In interviews, residents near Dargo spoke of unfamiliar accents among the attackers. Some described seeing men with equipment more advanced than what local groups typically use. One witness said, "They moved like they'd done this before, not just in Burkina, but somewhere else." It's impossible to draw firm conclusions without full investigations, which the government has pledged to carry out. But the early indicators are unsettling. And then came the silence again. International coverage focused on the casualties, but rarely questioned the deeper forces at play. Editorials expressed concern for the nation's stability, but few asked, what exactly was at stake? In a different world, the opening of a gold refinery and the push for agricultural independence would be seen as national milestones. But in the real world, they disrupt the flow of money and influence, and that disruption can come at a cost. President Traoré has not directly accused any foreign power. His speeches remain focused on unity, resilience, and sovereignty. But in his most recent address, he offered a subtle but unmistakable warning. Let no one mistake our silence for weakness. We know the value of peace, but we also know the price of freedom. For the people of Burkina Faso, that price is now etched in memory, not just in the names of the fallen, but in the unanswered questions that followed. Because while the world debated military tactics and headlines faded into the next news cycle, the real question remained: who struck the match? Not just who fired the first shot, but who benefits when the flames rise? Who loses when Burkina Faso gains control of its own resources? And why do these patterns echo in country after country that chooses to walk alone? The Dargo attack was not just a tragedy. It was a riddle, one that cannot be solved without looking past the smoke, past the uniforms, and into the shadows. In the days after Dargo, a wave of sorrow swept across Burkina Faso. But unlike past tragedies this time, sorrow didn't lead to silence. It led to something far stronger: resolve. There were no loud declarations, no parades, no fanfare. Instead, the response began in whispers, in the hands of mothers preparing food for soldiers returning to the field, in students holding signs that read, "We stand with our defenders in villages where farmers gathered not to flee, but to pledge they would not abandon their land." Across the country, the message was clear: Burkina Faso would not be broken. The government acted quickly. Within 72 hours, the Ministry of Defense announced a full compensation plan for the families of the fallen. Not as a token, but as a promise: financial aid, housing, and full scholarships for the children left behind. It wasn't charity. It was recognition that these families had given everything. In Ouagadougou, blood donation drives sprung up near public squares. Civil society groups, religious leaders, and student unions mobilized within hours. They didn't wait for orders. They responded like a nation that knew what was at stake. One of the most striking developments was the surge in volunteers for the country's civilian defense units, known as VDP. Many were young men from rural provinces who just months ago were unsure about joining. But after Dargo, uncertainty turned to purpose. One recruit, barely 20, told local media, "They didn't die in vain. I'm not joining to fight. I'm joining to protect what they believed in." Within the armed forces, the change was visible. Soldiers who had lost brothers in the attack insisted on returning to the same region. For them, it wasn't about revenge. It was about honor. At a memorial service held in the capital, rows of uniformed men and women stood at attention. Behind them, families held photos of the fallen, not as victims, but as guardians of a nation's dream. That image, quietly shared across social media, became symbolic not of war, but of commitment. Artists painted murals. Teachers led special lessons in schools, explaining what had happened, not just the attack, but what the soldiers stood for. In one classroom, a child was heard saying, "They didn't fall, they rose." In rural areas, elders met in traditional councils. They urged unity, not anger, cooperation, not fear. "If we leave," one elder said, "the soil forgets us. If we stay, it remembers." And the soil remembered. What could have fractured the country instead began to bond it, not by force, but through shared understanding. That freedom, true freedom, carries a cost. Not every nation is ready to pay it. But Burkina Faso, small though it may be, had chosen its road. President Ibrahim Traoré, in his next speech, did not rally for vengeance. He called for vigilance, for courage, and above all, for dignity. We have not lost. We have awakened. Our path is not easy, but it is ours. His words echoed not just through radio waves, but in the quiet determination of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Parents comforting neighbors, students writing tributes, merchants reopening shops even as fear lingered. To outsiders, it may have looked like a nation under pressure, but to those within it, felt like something else. A national binding, a collective breath, a silent vow. Because what Dargo took in blood, Burkina Faso answered in spirit. This wasn't about fighting back. It was about standing tall. And that may be the most powerful response of all. There are moments in history that change more than the immediate battlefield. They redraw maps. They shift alliances. They reset the moral compass of entire regions. Could Dargo become one of those moments? To understand its significance, we must look beyond the tragedy itself and into the deeper challenge it represents to the existing global order. In the 1950s, a remote valley in Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu became the site of a military upset that marked the end of French colonial rule in Indochina. It wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was a psychological one. A smaller, poorer force had defied a global empire and won. Now, some observers are beginning to wonder, is Dargo playing a similar role in Africa? Burkina Faso, under President Ibrahim Traoré, has taken steps few countries dare to take in today's globalized landscape. It has rejected foreign military presence, demanded full control over its mineral wealth, and launched policies that prioritize food independence over foreign aid. To many, these are bold moves. To others, they are dangerous. But to the citizens of Burkina Faso, they are necessary. Dargo was not just an attack on a military base. It was a strike at the heart of these reforms. When the government nationalized gold mining concessions and opened its own refinery, it didn't just keep wealth within its borders. It disrupted profit chains that have existed for decades. It challenged unspoken arrangements that have long shaped how resources flow from Africa to the world. This is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about a model. If one country can successfully manage its own wealth, educate its own children, defend its own borders, and feed its own people, what does that mean for others? It means the model of dependency, long framed as development, begins to lose credibility. It means sovereignty becomes a realistic goal, not just a slogan. And that scares more than just insurgent groups. The Dargo attack, strategically timed, came amid a wave of reforms that threatened both illicit networks and formal institutions that benefit from the status quo. By targeting a symbol of local military strength, it sent a message pushed too far, and you'll pay the price. But here's the unexpected result, and Burkina Faso pushed anyway. Rather than retracting its policies, the government doubled down. More funding was allocated to the volunteers for the defense of the homeland. Agricultural programs aimed at rice and wheat self-sufficiency were expanded. A new audit of mining contracts was launched to investigate historical irregularities. If anything, Dargo accelerated the shift, not just politically, but culturally. In universities across West Africa, Dargo is now being studied not simply as a case of insurgency, but as a case study in strategic resistance. In Bamako, students compare Traoré's speeches to Sankara's. In Niamey, community radio hosts quote him next to Kwame Nkrumah. Something is happening beneath the headlines. Across the continent, young people are beginning to ask not only what they want, but what they're willing to endure to get it. If sovereignty means sacrifice, is it still worth it? For many, the answer is yes. And that's what makes Dargo powerful. It didn't stop the movement. It revealed the stakes. Much like Dien Bien Phu, it turned the global gaze toward a place most decision-makers once overlooked. It proved that resilience can rewrite expectations. That small nations, when organized and determined, are not as fragile as they're often portrayed. Burkina Faso may not have the largest army or the strongest economy, but it has something that can't be purchased or deployed from a broad belief. Belief that a nation should shape its own destiny. Belief that sovereignty is not an option but a right. Belief that the people of Africa are not just survivors of history, but authors of the future. And when that belief is tested and holds the implications, reach far beyond its borders. Already neighboring governments in Mali and Niger have pledged deeper cooperation. The alliance between these nations, once seen as temporary, is now evolving into something more coordinated: shared intelligence, joint infrastructure, mutual political support. This is not a rebellion. It is the slow emergence of a new political identity across the Sahel, one that values partnership, not patronage, accountability, not charity. To the West, this may feel like fragmentation. To many in Africa, it feels like foundation. So is Dargo the new Dien Bien Phu, time will tell. But one thing is already clear. It was not the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a new one. Not a collapse, a crossroads. There are moments in history when the questions are bigger than the headlines. 50 soldiers lost their lives in Dargo. But what they defended cannot be measured in numbers alone. They stood for a principle that even in a world shaped by power, a small nation still has the right to choose its path. For young Africans, this story is a challenge. What kind of future will you inherit, one shaped for you or by you? And for older Americans who watched their own nation rise through struggle and defiance, the question may feel uncomfortably familiar. If another people stands for freedom, but does so without permission, will we recognize that courage or doubt it? the United States was born in resistance to empire. Its founders rejected the belief that security could only come through dependence. So when another country does the same, should we not see a reflection, not a threat? Burkina Faso is not perfect. No country is. But its choice to reclaim what was lost, to defend what was ignored, deserves more than skepticism. It deserves attention and maybe respect. Because what burned in Dargo was not just a base. It was a false belief that independence must always be managed by others. In its place, something else now rises: clarity. So if you've ever believed that truth matters more than fear, if you remember what it meant to question the powerful, then let Dargo remind you. Let it stir something long buried. The belief that dignity once awakened does not go quietly. If you ever believed in justice, not just for one nation, but for all, then now is the time to remember why.